When you hear the word submission, what is your first response? Is it a word that you have positive associations with, or is it a word that carries more of a negative connotation for you? I suspect for many people, the word submission is not a positive word. One definition of submission is the action or fact of accepting or yielding to a superior force or to the will or authority of another person. We may think of one people conquering another people, and by force, they were forced into submission. We may associate submission with surrender, capitulation, defeat, or weakness. For the mixed martial arts fans tuning in today, and I'm sure we have many, you know that submission is when an athlete taps out or verbally concedes a match due to pain or injury or to avoid being choked out or simply for a desire to end the match. And in all these ways, submission sounds weak and powerless. It can even feel humiliating. Some of you are already thinking, this doesn't sound particularly appealing or desirable at all, but I've got a sinking feeling that Doug is going to spend the next 20 minutes or so telling me this is actually good for me. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. Listen to what the Apostle Paul has to say about submission in Galatians chapter 2 and verses 19 and 20. I have been crucified with Christ. And it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, or in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. The thing I want you to remember from today is that submission is the freedom that comes from surrender. Submission is the freedom that comes from surrender. Paul surrendered his life to Christ, just as Christ had surrendered his life to God. Paul said, I have been crucified with Christ, and the result of that is that the old Paul, and for him it was even the old Saul, was now dead. And it was Christ who lived in Paul from that moment on. And the rest of Paul's life was lived motivated by the faith of Christ and the faith in Christ, who loved him and surrendered his life for him on the cross. Now, if we look at what we know of Paul's life, we know he lived with tremendous freedom and courage and boldness and passion and conviction. No one would mistake Paul's surrendering his life and his submission to God's will as producing a person who was weak or defeated or humiliated. Submission is the freedom that comes from surrender. And while the words submission and surrender may be negative words for many of us at first, spiritually speaking, submission and surrender are not only positive words, they are essential actions. The purpose of submission is to free us. So let's begin with the understanding that in all of our relationships, healthy submission is an act that's expressed mutually, voluntarily, humbly, and out of a desire to serve and help and to bless others. And this is true in all Christian relationships. In Ephesians 5 and verse 21 in the New Living Translation, Paul tells us to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And the discipline of submission frees us from our self-centeredness, and it allows us to consider the desires of others. Submission has nothing to do with being weak. It allows us to be strong enough to open up our hearts to other people. Richard Foster says that the freedom that comes with submission is the ability to lay down the terrible burden of always needing to get our own way. The obsession to demand that things go the way we want them to go is one of the greatest bondages in human society. Submission or self-denial helps free us from the corrosive power of pride and of self-pity. Most of the disagreements and struggles that occur in a family, at work, in a school, in a church, in politics, they almost all have to do with people insisting on getting their own way. And people will struggle, they'll argue, they'll get mad, they'll lie, they'll occasionally leave a relationship because they don't get their own way. Now, this is not to say that followers of Jesus should never have different opinions that need to be rationally discussed, analyzed, pondered, and considered. However, the truth is simply that we also need to learn how to practice the discipline of submission. And that's why our tool for today is a file. A file. Because what does a file do? A file helps to smooth away the sharp and jagged edges of a piece of wood, to help wood to fit better with another piece of wood, and also just so it's smoother to the touch. Richard Foster writes, people will spend weeks, months, even years in a perpetual stew just because some little thing didn't go as they wished. And they'll fuss and they'll fume and they'll get mad about it. They'll act as if their very life hangs on the issue. They may even get an ulcer over it. And in the discipline of submission, we are released to drop the matter, to forget it. Frankly, most things in life are not nearly as important as we think they are. Our lives will not come to an end if this thing or that does not happen. If you watch these things, he says, you will see that almost all church fights and splits occur because people do not have the freedom to give in to each other. We insist that a critical issue is at stake, that we're fighting for a sacred principle. Perhaps this is the case. Usually, it's not. Often we cannot stand to give in simply because it means we will not get our own way. Only in submission are we enabled to bring this spirit to a place where it no longer controls us. Only submission can free us sufficiently to be able to distinguish between genuine issues and stubborn self-will. I like the old story of the captain of the ship who looked out one dark night and saw a faint light on the horizon, and immediately he told the signalman to send a message, alter your course 10 degrees south. Promptly a return message came back, alter your course 10 degrees north. Angry that he hadn't gotten his way and that his order was being ignored, the captain sent a second message, alter your course 10 degrees south. I am the captain. Quickly the answer came back, alter your course 10 degrees north. I'm a seaman, third class. The captain fired off a third and final message. Alter your course 10 degrees south. I'm a battleship. And the reply came back, alter your course 10 degrees north. I'm a lighthouse. Sometimes insisting on our own way can be harmful and dangerous. Getting what our stubbornness demands, being able to do whatever we want, refusing to seek and to submit to God's good desire for us can shipwreck our lives. In Psalm 81 in verses 11 and 12, God laments, but my people did not listen to my voice. Israel would not submit to me. So I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. God equates submission with listening to God's voice and acting on what is heard. Now, sometimes individuals can look at the same situation and see it completely differently. with both parties believing that they have or they see the will of God. And in such cases, prayerful discernment, listening, seeking God's leading in the Scriptures, and even getting the counsel of a larger group of believers may be necessary, as well as an openness to submitting our previous view for a new and even unexpected one. This may mean, brace yourself, we may sometimes actually have to have the grace and the maturity to say we were wrong. We were wrong about something or someone. The result of not listening to God and failing to submit our will to God's will is that God lets us have our own way and all the consequences that go with it. God lets us follow our stubborn hearts and our own counsels and ideas. But like a heart-sick parent, God cries out in Psalm 81 in the very next verse, in verse 13, "Oh, that my people would listen to me, and that Israel would walk in my ways." You know, most things in life are not what I call kingdom issues. They simply don't matter. In a nation and in a world trying to overcome a global pandemic, violence, the lust for power, the erosion of truth, hunger, illness, hatred, greed, injustice, how important do you think the little decisions that we can invest so much time and energy and emotional capital in truly are in God's eyes? Whether one's putting together a program or making policy decisions on a team or a board or choosing colors or light fixtures for a home remodel, ultimately, most of it just doesn't matter. It's of no eternal significance. How we treat one another is far more important. However, for many people, our tendency is, at home, at school, at work, or church, whatever we care about, whatever we invest our energy and our passion in, we want everyone else to feel it's just as important as we do. And then if someone doesn't share our view, our position, our perspective, or if things don't go the way we want them to go, you know what we sometimes do, right? We say, it's okay. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Whatever we do is fine. We say that with our words, but our tone, our expression, our body language, our behavior often make it very obvious we do care, and it does matter, and whatever we do is fine, only if it's what we think should be done. And we don't want to alter our course by a single degree. And we don't want anyone to tell us we need to. Outwardly, we may do what other people have decided, but inwardly, we're furious. Well, again, Richard Foster points out, the biblical teaching on submission focuses primarily on the spirit with which we view other people. We are to view other people with consideration, with thoughtfulness, with empathy and humility. And some of us need to pray about whether we need to do a better job of that. Too many powerful people don't seem to be doing it at all. There's too much arrogance, snideness, and just plain old-fashioned meanness in our culture. And it's extremely harmful. And it's especially distasteful in people who claim to be followers of Christ. Paul says in Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, and Romans 12, verses 16 to 18, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than yourselves. Let each of you look not to your own interest, but to the interests of others. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Do not claim to be wiser than you are. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Boy, wouldn't it be nice to live in a community or a country like that? Well, the truth is we can only live the way that Paul describes in Philippians and Romans if we've surrendered to Christ and if we are living in the freedom that comes from submission. Submission is an ethical theme that runs actually throughout the New Testament, and it's clearly expected of all Christians. Now, regrettably, some people have used passages about submission in a Christian household from Ephesians chapter 5 through chapter 6, verse 9, and in 1 Peter chapter 3 to put women or children down or to even try to excuse abuse in a marriage or in another relationship. There is no excuse for abuse in any relationship, period. What's interesting is that women, children, and slaves had little or no rights whatsoever in Roman society, and yet in Ephesians, Paul addresses them all as if they are free moral agents who can choose their attitude and their behavior toward their husband or father or master. And that's really a radical statement to make at that time, as was telling men that they needed to be subject to others out of reverence for Christ. Now, the reason why we're commanded to live lives of mutual submission, regardless of our place in life, is because Jesus, who is our leader and our example, lived a life of submission. And Jesus issues a call to submission to all who follow him that we use to begin this service. If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves. Let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. The self-denial involved in following Jesus means in part that we do not have to have our own way. That's why we sang Adelaide Potter's hymn, "Have thine own way, Lord, have thine own way. Thou art the potter, I am the clay. Mold me and make me after thy will, while I am waiting, yielded and still." We need to make sure in our relationship with God we don't forget God's the potter, we're not. Self-denial isn't the same thing as the loss of self. The paradoxical truth is the way to self-fulfillment is through self-denial. And self-denial is simply the freedom to give way to others. And not only do submission and self-denial help us to deal with issues of pride and of power, they also free us from self-pity. Because just as we may submit outwardly but inwardly be angry, as I said earlier, there's also a temptation to submit outwardly but inwardly to be filled with a sense of self-pity and martyrdom, which is really a spirit of self-indulgence. Oh, it's all right, I'll give up. We'll do whatever you want. That's not what we're talking about either. The language of submission and self-denial is so absent from the world in which we're living that the words of great Christians from earlier centuries about submission and self-denial sound like something from an alien, from another world. For example, Thomas à Kempis of The Imitation of Christ, a great, great Christian devotional work, wrote to have no opinion of ourselves and to think always well and highly of others is great wisdom and perfection. Ultimately, submission is about surrender. One of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, published his correspondence with the great psychiatrist Carl Jung, and he thanked Jung for his contribution to AA. He said, "You have no idea how important a role you played in forging the famous 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. You were treating a man named Roland H., and you said, 'Roland, you're a hopeless alcoholic. There's nothing more I can do for you except take your money, and I don't want to do that.' Roland asked, 'Is there anything I can do?' And you said, 'Yes, there's something you can do. Have a religious conversion. Have a religious experience.' And Roland H. did have a religious experience, and he became sober and a recovering alcoholic." And Wilson continued, he said, "At the time I was reading William James, A Variety of Religious Experience. And I noticed at the bottom of every religious experience was that turning your life over to God, that surrender to God. So I went home and I said, 'God, I don't know if I even believe in you, but if you're there, God, will you help me, please?' In that moment, I knew I was healed. In that moment, I knew that the addiction was broken, that I was a free man, maybe for the first time in my life." The peace and strength that we all long to experience, that peace and strength of God can be ours, but it comes at the price of surrender. Submission is the freedom that comes from surrender. Why did God listen to and answer the prayers of Jesus? Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7 tells us, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard. Why? Because of his reverent submission. You know, to applaud the will of God, to do the will of God, even to fight for the will of God is not difficult until it comes at cross purposes with our own will. And then the battle lines are drawn. That's when we find out if we're willing to submit to God, that we no longer have to get our own way. That's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13 about love, that love does not insist on its own way. Love is willing to yield. That's something good to remember, not only on Valentine's Day, but all year long. In his book, With Christ in the School of Obedience, Andrew Murray writes, "The true pupil of a great musician or painter yields his master a wholehearted and unhesitating submission. In practicing his scales or mixing his colors, in the slow and patient study of the elements of his art, he knows that it is wisdom to simply and fully obey. It is this wholehearted surrender to his guidance, this implicit submission to his authority, which Christ asks. We come to him asking him to teach us the lost art of obeying God as he did. The only way to learn to do a thing is to do it. The only way of learning obedience from Christ is to give up your will to him and make the doing of his will the one desire and delight of your heart. May that be true of every one of us. Let's pray. Father, I abandon myself into your hands. Do with me what you will. Whatever you may do, I thank you. I am ready for all. I accept all. Let only your will be done in me and in all your creatures. I wish no more than this, O Lord. Help me to surrender to you fully, that I may keep my eyes fixed on you and follow you all the days of my life. Amen.